Thank you. Two quick questions, one for the community and one for my own sanity. I feel we are in the middle of the process of dumbing down our nation, as evidenced by the fact that one side is easily manipulated by the lies their quote-unquote leadership feeds them hourly by social media and by, frankly, their lack of education. The easiest people to lead are the least educated among us. And America being ranked 58th in the world in education is quite appalling. My question for the community is when our government is going to start taking education more serious as our defense spending, and increase spending. Take it serious as our defense spending and increase funds to our soon-to-be broken education system. My question for my own sanity is if you will be serving on any of these committees to offset the lunacy and circus I expect will come from the Republican-led congressional. Amen. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your brilliant and epic sit down and Clay Higgins for having spoke to Rita Salter during the fossil fuel hearing, and congratulations on your engagement.
Thank you. So I will say this. So committee assignments are not official yet. I anticipate that those assignments should be finalized next week. So I fly back to DC on Tuesday and I'll be in DC next week. I anticipate when we get there, we're gonna have those committee assignments finalized. So I can't say anything for sure, but the way that generally things work and from what we've heard, as well as through some of our conversations, is that it seems as though on the Republican side, they have appointed Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Paul Gosar to the House Oversight Committee. A committee that I have 4 years of seniority on and have been assigned to, whose new ranking member. So at every committee, you kind of have the top Republican and the top Democrat. And if you are the top member of that party from the majority party, you become the chair. And if you are the top member of the minority party, you become the ranking member. Which is why control of the House, majority of the House is so important, because if there's a Republican majority, all the chairs of the committees are Republican, and if there's a Democratic majority, all the chairs are Democrats. Now the ranking member, the incoming ranking member, will be Congressman Jamie Raskin of House Oversight, an incredible human being. I have served as Congressman Raskin's vice chair on the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Subcommittee of House Oversight. Usually when you are an incumbent on that committee, you have first preference to decide if you stay on that committee. And so that's usually how it goes. My intention is to stay on the House Oversight Committee and provide full support to Ranking Member Raskin. And we're also gonna have to kind of manage this clown car that's going on the other side. And so, so that's what we're doing there. But in oversight, what that means is that the chair determines and authorizes when hearings go on and what subject matters, happen. So we can't necessarily, if they want to go after Hunter Biden's laptop and do this whole thing with it, we can't stop them, but we can embarrass them. So there's that. But I will say that in the past, we have been able to secure certain bipartisan hearings. Now, depending on the incoming chair, Congressman Comer, we will see what his appetite is to continue doing that. But I do want to say some of the past areas where we've been able to have bipartisan consensus, believe it or not. We held a hearing late last term on bipartisan solutions to cannabis reform. We, in the past, have held bipartisan hearings going after defense contractors and abuse of our public funds by defense contractors. So those of you who don't know, the Department of Defense is one of the only agencies that have not really been able to pass an audit. And so you're right, we shovel so much money there. I vote against the defense budget every year, and one major reason of that is because of this just complete lack of accountability. And we know if you've been a teacher in a school, every single penny you spend must be accounted for. Every single dollar in healthcare, in all of this. So when it comes to helping people, we are like this. But when it comes to our defense budget, I mean, the amount of waste and abuse and fraud is out of control. So in the past, that has been a point of bipartisan hearings, and I've been able, through my questioning, to really go after some of these contractors that have actually resulted in getting funds back from them. But it really depends on what their what they choose. Like if they decide to try to hold some bipartisan hearings, we might be able to get some progress on that. Our alternatives is to start sending letters directly to the Biden administration on some of these issues. And we've already started doing that with respect to some issues around immigration, defense, etc. Because, you know, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, oversight is necessary.
So I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair would remind all members to address their comments during the various debates to the chair. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from New York. Oh, I'm sorry. For what purpose?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I yield to the gentlewoman from New York.
Thank you. Thank you to Ranking Member Pallone. You know, I understand in this body it's not the first time that it seems as though the opposing side can't seem to be able to debate the issue. And so they must come after my character. While I cannot control the fact that the other side seems to have made the assumption that I am uneducated, one of the things that I can say, or you know what they may say about my worldview, one of the things that I can say is that while I may not work for Wall Street, that is true. I may not be here with the mission to increase profits for corporations. That is true. My mission here is for the well-being and dignity of our family and our planet's future, for our children's ability to live on this planet. That is what this amendment is about. Moreover, when we talk about education, we should all take it upon ourselves in this body to educate ourselves on the science of the challenge of climate change that is before us. By around 2050, we are looking at the Western states to be projected to further increase, wildfires to further increase 2 to 6 times. And that is just scratching the surface. Thank you, and I yield back to the ranking member.
New Jersey.
And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from New Jersey yields back. Lady from New York yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I rise in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment.
Let me state again that H.R. 21 is about strengthening the SPR by requiring non-emergency use to be accompanied by a plan to produce American oil resources. You know, I invite the members across the aisle to actually go out and talk to oil and gas producers, understand leases, understand that every square acre out in the ocean or on land doesn't have oil or gas under it. They've got to find it. They've got to start drilling, exploring, producing. And once they produce, they've got to pipe that either to the beach or put it on a ship to be taken to refineries. They have permitting process for pipelines that do that. Permitting processes to get the well actually permitted once they discover resources. Go and learn. Go and learn for yourself about this. Educate yourself on how America attained its low emissions. If you care about the air quality, you care about climate change. Natural gas is what got America there. Educate yourself on that. Then we can have a better debate about future resources, future energy production. But this debate tonight is not about any of that. It's about the SPR. It's about the fact that the Biden administration drew down on the SPR for one purpose, to lower gas prices for Americans right before an election. That's influential politics. This is about efficient, clean American energy production. Efforts to reduce our production means the world relies more on nations that do not impose state-of-the-art controls on emissions. Think Russia, think China. Think about what America has done. This amendment would limit clean energy, American-produced clean energy, and increase emissions-heavy foreign energy. You know, it hurts me when I see an American LNG tanker in the Boston Harbor when we have a natural gas here in this country, cleaner burning natural gas. This is about the SPR. As chair of the Energy Subcommittee, I look forward to a lot of debates on energy resources, American energy production, and clean energy, and what works to make America energy dominant once again. But we're not doing it tonight. We're going to talk about the spore. We're going to talk about replenishing it. We're going to talk about American resources. It's counterproductive to energy security, this amendment is, and addressing climate risk. American oil production is the cleanest in the world, where it's produced and where it's used. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. I yield back.
The lady from New York is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment prohibits fossil fuel companies that have engaged in stock buybacks over the last decade from leasing land for oil production, particularly with respect to the strategic reserve. You know, I've sat here for much of today and listened to many of my colleagues, particularly those on the opposite side of the aisle, introduce amendments and legislation that conveniently benefit the fossil fuel industry while fear-mongering about things like the Green New Deal and positive climate action, to which I say, boo. Last year, 4 of the major oil companies, Shell, Chevron, BP, and ExxonMobil, posted record profits totaling $75 billion. Speaking of $75 billion, yesterday it was announced that Chevron will spend $75 billion on buying back their own stock after reaping record quarterly profits in 2022, driving up their own stock prices and padding CEO compensation. This reckless Wall Street profiteering at the public's expense and the planet's expense should have consequences. In this bill, the Republican majority seeks to give away even more sensitive land for oil and gas development without even the pretense of a guarantee that it would even lower gas prices. This amendment is simple. Companies who engaged in stock buybacks in the last 10 years should be prohibited from leasing new land for oil and gas production. I urge the adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from New York is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Let's get to our second point of business here and break down this myth that oil companies need even more permits. This is simply not true. Though, in fact, the oil industry already possesses more than 9,000 unused drilling permits on federal lands. Nearly 5,000 of those permits were approved in 2021 alone. The oil industry already has at least 10 years worth of unused leases at its disposal. They are only producing oil or gas on roughly half the area that is already leased. And there are nearly 14 million acres onshore and more than 9 million acres offshore that are currently under lease but are not being used for oil production. Why lease even more? My amendment prohibits oil and gas leasing on federal lands in a way that would increase even further our net carbon emissions. That is to say, we shall not include any federal lands where oil and gas leasing would increase net carbon emissions. I urge the adoption of the amendment and yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. You know, this hearing is called Federal Pandemic Spending, a Prescription for Waste, Abuse, and Fraud. UI, unemployment assistance, the Paycheck Protection Program, all of it. And in the wind-up to this hearing on January 13th, I see that the chair sent several letters to 3 states, Pennsylvania, California, and my home state of New York, with serious allegations of widespread fraud and abuse. But I'm curious a little bit about how we got to these 3 states. Mr. Daddario, if you were auditing or investigating what went wrong in states in the distribution of pandemic-related unemployment insurance, how would you go about choosing which states to examine?
Well, we would look at a number of factors. One would be the amount of money that would go there. We would look for geographic distribution of the programs. We would look for other characteristics of state programs, a number of claims, for example, that have been there. And so we would take a nationwide sample.
And even, in your experience looking at perhaps even something like a per capita approach or in your expertise, if you had to estimate some of the top candidate states, what do you think some of those states would be and why? And again, more on like a per capita level. Yeah,
I don't have the per capita numbers in my head, so I don't want to venture a guess at this point. I'd be happy to provide something for the record.
Overall, let's say not from per capita, what would be some of the top states that you would look at in terms of your experience and oversight of these programs?
Well, certainly California and New York are always candidates to look at in those cases. But you have Michigan, you have Florida, you have states in the South and the West. And so we would have a geographic distribution in order to make sure that we cover the money. What we try to do in these cases is cover, like right now, we're looking at the state and local coronavirus relief fund. And we've selected 18 states, and we're looking at, they account for about 60% of the total amount of money.
Thank you, Mr. Dodaro. I'd like to submit to the record this report from the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee entitled Key Insights State Pandemic Unemployment Insurance Programs. Now, Mr. Hartz and Mr. Dodaro, can you think of any methodology that would have brought the committee to send those 3 letters specifically to just those 3 states? Is there any methodology you can think of done by this committee?
Well, I would defer to the committee. I don't really know what their objectives were in that case, and I don't think.
I understand.
Yeah.
Now, I want to dig into this report. According to this report at PRAC, for example, Arizona paid $1.6 billion to individuals to stolen identities to get unemployment insurance benefits. Louisiana dispersed more than $1 million to individuals after the date of their death. And in Kentucky, state employees applied for unemployment benefits while still employed by the state and were able to hack the state's information management system and remove holds on their own accounts, and none of these states have been put under investigation by this committee. I find it very interesting because, as was stated at the beginning, the bipartisan nature of oversight is what gives it its power. And what we are seeing are investigations into, and I believe that the methodology for these 3 states is highly questionable. I ask for this committee, if we're going to perform oversight, then let's perform oversight. Congressional Democrats are ready to perform that oversight and help our constituents get the benefits they need to pay their bills. And I think that there's no shortage of members of this committee who are willing to stand up to their own party when it's necessary. But I cannot, for the life of me, understand why the majority would send these 3 letters just to these 3 states that leave us with no other conclusion that there may be some rank partisanship in this investigation. Committee Republicans, I ask, if we're going to start off, let's do it right. And with that, I yield my time.
Before I yield back, if the Ms. Ocasio-Cortez is willing, I would love to join in a joint investigation of the Kentucky unemployment system and New York unemployment system if you wanted to do that, a joint probe or whatever. I would love to work with you on that, or any of the 50 states, because I believe it's a problem in all 50 states, especially Kentucky. You're exactly right.
Please.
Thank you, and I yield back. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It can be difficult to remember, given all that has happened in the last 3 years, but I'd like us to envision ourselves back in those first few months of the pandemic in the spring of 2020. In March and April of 2020 alone, the economy lost more than 22 million jobs, and the unemployment rate skyrocketed to 14.7%. Jobs in sectors that are absolutely essential to the American economy were threatened. But after the CARES Act, states were able to put in place expanded unemployment insurance programs to assist workers who had lost their jobs. And census data shows that these expanded benefits kept approximately 5.5 million people out of poverty in 2020. Ms. Dixon, I'm curious about, from your vantage point, how expanded unemployment insurance played out as such a vital lifeline for workers as well as states during the pandemic.
So one of the reasons that Congress put in place these programs is because the unemployment insurance program in the states is inadequate. Inadequate in who it covers, inadequate in how much the weekly benefit amount is. And so when Congress added $600 a week and then $300, that was amazing, especially in states where the average benefit is only, the national average benefit is only $300 a week. And so this made it possible for folks to stay in their homes. They didn't have to choose between food and gas in their cars. It was critical. And I think that, like, part of what we have to do is learn from the successes. So we've talked a lot about instances where there was identity theft and fraud, but we haven't talked about the amazing number of folks who got UI for the first time and what it meant for them and their ability to stay attached to the workforce. And so I think we really have to mine the data on the good pieces and figure out what we can carry forward and what Congress can do to actually carry those pieces forward as a minimum standard for states to implement.
Absolutely. Thank you for that information, because you know, for so much in this hearing, there's a constant focus, not just on the notion of the pandemic response being fraudulent or wasteful, but it seems as though a particular fixation on the unemployment program, which, as you stated, if it weren't for the federal unemployment supplemental program, families would have been potentially enduring months of unemployment and having to just scrounge by on as little as $300 a week. And especially when it comes to skyrocketing costs of housing, would it be also in your assessment that this could have also potentially, without that federal response, dramatically expanded the amount of housing insecurity and people who may even be struggling with homelessness if it weren't for that supplemental?
It absolutely did. Because even though there were also things that Congress created that were housing supplements and assistance, it did take a while to get out. And the UI program is the quickest way to get money into the pockets of workers. And so this really did have a critical influence on being able to stay in homes and for folks to be able to pay their rent and to not, and you know, there was an eviction moratorium, but it also means that they're not sitting there with $10,000 of back rent that they can never pay. So it just kept them, you know, it kept them going in a way that made sure that they weren't incurring debt to actually try to just do their basic living expenses.
Absolutely. And you know, despite experiencing the worst job losses, the United States experiencing the worst job losses since the Great Depression during that early COVID period, the COVID-19 recession was also the shortest on record. But to expand on this point that you're making, how did these pandemic relief programs, and particularly unemployment insurance, help stabilize the economy even from a more macro perspective?
So because so much of our economy is based on consumer spending, that's the first thing that families cut back on. And so we know it's kind of like it's an unvirtuous cycle. So there's an economic downturn, there's a contraction, and it just gets worse and worse. And so the UI program actually did what it was designed to do, which was to stabilize the economy, to stabilize communities and state economies, and to prevent that downward spiral, and to prevent a double dip recession, which we had some experience with a pretty terrible recession not that long ago. And so just being able to get through this pandemic without that protracted recession and also without that protracted high unemployment.
Woman from New York, Representative Ocasio-Cortez.
All right,
The gentlewoman is
just 1 minute.
recognized
Let's
for
go.
1 minute.
Thank you. Now, As a fellow New Yorker, I think one of the things that we should talk about here is also one of the disgusting legacies after 9/11 has been the targeting and racism against Muslim Americans throughout the United States of America, and this is an extension of that legacy. Consistency, there is nothing consistent with the Republican Party's continued attack except for the racism and incitement of violence against women of color in this body. I had a member of the Republican caucus threaten my life, and you all and the Republican caucus rewarded him with one of the most prestigious committee assignments in this Congress. Don't tell me this is about consistency. Don't tell me that this is about a condemnation of anti-Semitic remarks when you have a member of the Republican caucus who has talked about Jewish space lasers and an entire amount of tropes and also elevated her to some of the highest committee assignments in this body. This is about targeting women of color in the United States of America. Don't tell me, because I didn't get a single apology when my life was threatened. Thank you.
Mr. Magaziner from Rhode Island, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I'll yield to Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you. It continues to seem as though there is confusion about the substance of the amendment itself. Several references to a but. There is not one but in the language of this one paragraph amendment. Public health impact is a neutral term. It does not specifically cite negative impact. But importantly, many of us have traveled throughout the country to varying different sites of energy production. I have visited with families who say that they will be near an extraction site, and at different times of the day, their lungs start burning. I personally represent an area of the country that has some of the highest childhood asthma rates in the world. In a parallel committee that I also serve on, the Oversight Committee, we conducted certain investigations on the exposure of people to PFAS and the inordinate amount of reproductive cancers and other cancers that have been developed due to exposures nearby airports, military sites, et cetera. People deserve to know if they're being poisoned. People deserve to know if there's no health impact. People deserve to know if they're living near a place that is helping them or hurting them. And that is the basis of this one paragraph amendment. There have been so many times in history where people have been told by companies, by governments, that what they are near is safe, and they find out later on that they were not. And whether it is mountaintop extraction, whether it is PFAS exposure, whether it is fossil fuel extraction, we should not turn a blind eye to where there may be evidence that people may be encountering a health harm, especially when it comes to public policy. So that really is the substance of this amendment. The amendment itself does not speak to drilling. It does not speak to ending it. It does not speak to any of that. It is saying people, we deserve and we should study the health impacts of this production, including water quality, the health impacts of carbon pollution, and public health. That's what this says. I don't know what language other folks are reading, but the paragraph is right here. I believe it's been provided to everybody, and I believe that people deserve to know if they are safe or if they are unsafe when exposed to certain extraction sites. And with that, I yield back to Mr. Magaziner.
Thank you. And I'll just say again, this amendment does not strike a single word from the original text. So all of the topics that members of the majority have just run through, there's nothing to stop us from looking at any of them, from looking at the serious issues that you've raised, from looking at the wacky off-the-wall issues that you may raise. There's nothing to stop this committee from engaging in all of those topics. This is purely additive. Why would we not want to expand the body of information that we provide to the public and to this committee in its policymaking? Why do we want to bury our heads in the sand and deny people information about the impacts of extractive industries? Once again, nothing here strikes or cuts the ability to look at anything else. This is just about giving the American people the facts and giving us as a committee the facts so that we can make good decisions. And I'll just echo once again what others have said. We know that Low-income communities, particularly communities of color, do bear the brunt of the climate crisis. We see it in asthma rates. We see it in cancer rates. We see it in a range of climate-related health outcomes. So why would we want to hide this information from the American people? This is purely additive to the scope of the committee's work. It does not eliminate our ability to look at any other topic. And with that, I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman from California. I'd like to raise and follow up on a point that the opposition and the other side of the aisle is making, which is trying to insinuate that there is something scandalous or unusual about federal agency outreach to social media platforms and other organizations such as Twitter. The insinuation here is that in the FBI and other agencies reaching out to Twitter, that there's something nefarious about this, that this was some sort of partisan weaponization or attempt to intimidate. But we actually have quite a documented history of representatives from the Trump administration hailing the progress that the government had made in working with companies like Twitter to counter foreign influence operations and other areas of concern. In early March 2020, right before the Super Tuesday primary election, several Trump administration officials, including Mike Pompeo, Bill Barr, Chad Wolf, and acting director of national intelligence, Richard Grenell, issued a statement praising the government's cooperation with the private sector to fend off foreign interference and said that relationship was, quote, stronger than it's ever been. This was around this whole time where there's this grievance around this. And listen to what DHS Secretary Chad Wolf had to say just weeks before the 2020 presidential election. We now have direct lines of communication with tech and social media companies and election officials so that both parties can seamlessly take action against false information spreading online. I would argue that this information from the Trump administration would say that they would support your decision in temporarily suspending this disinformation that seemed to be coming out from the New York Post. So with that, I yield back to the chair.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes.
Thank you.
Gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the ranking member and my colleague from Maryland. It is rich, so rich to hear the other side discuss the sacred right of voting, discuss what our veterans and our service members fought for in the sacred right of voting, while defending and continuing to defend the disenfranchisement of American citizens in D.C. for their right to vote. They don't believe in statehood. They don't believe in the actual enfranchisement and voting rights for D.C. residents who are U.S. citizens, and yet they have the audacity and the gall to not just continue in that position and claim they believe in the sacred right to vote while denying that right to vote for an overwhelmingly black city, but then expanding their position so that in direct contradiction of their quote-unquote conservative values of small government and defending freedom have decided to expand the jurisdiction of this body to meddle into the business of D.C. residents. The D.C. City Council has the right to determine its policies for D.C. residents. And if any member of this body does not like that, they can feel free to change their registration, resign their post, and run for D.C. City Council. And for those who are residents here of Washington, D.C., they could have, as the ranking member stated, gone to any one of the many hearings on this issue. I understand that there may be disagreement. I understand that that Republicans may not be happy with what the D.C. City Council is doing. But when cities in Vermont passed the same provisions, when San Francisco, when 9 Maryland cities brought up this provision, did the Republican Party corral all of Congress and bring this issue down to the floor for a vote? No, they did not. They are singling out the residents of the District of Columbia and expanding in the history of disenfranchisement that goes all the way back to the legacy of slavery. And they're bringing it right here to this floor because why? They don't have any real bills to debate. We're not here to talk about health care. We're not here to talk about abortion. We're not here to talk about voting rights. We're here to talk about the expansion and the continued subjugation and disenfranchisement of the people of the District of Columbia. Let them govern themselves. And with that, I yield back to the ranking member.
Behind me, which is an example of one of thousands, shows on November 3rd, 2020, that you, Mr. Roth, a Twitter employee, were exchanging communications on Jira, a private cloud server, with CISA, NASS, NASED, and Alex Stamos, who now works at Stanford and is a former security officer at Facebook, to remove a posting. Do you now remember communicating on a private cloud server to remove a posting? Yes or no?
I wouldn't agree with the characterization.
I don't care if you agree. This is your stuff. Yes or no, did you communicate with a private entity, the government agency, on a private cloud server, yes or no?
The question was if I
Yes or no? Yeah, I'm on time. Yes or no?
Ma'am, I don't believe I can give you a yes or no
Well,
answer
I'm
to
going
that
to tell you right now that you did, and we have proof of it. This, ladies and gentlemen, is joint action between the federal government and a private company to censor and violate the First Amendment. This is also known, and I'm so glad that there's many attorneys on this panel, joint state actors. It's highly illegal. You are all engaged in this action, and I want you to know that you will be all held accountable. Ms. Gaddy, are you still on CISA's Cybersecurity Advisory Council? Yes or no?
Yes, I am.
Okay. For those who have said that this is a pointless hearing, and I just want to let you guys all know, we found that Twitter was indeed communicating with the federal government to censor Americans. I'd like to remind you that this was all in place before January 6th. So to say that these mechanisms weren't in place and to make it about January 6th, I want to let you know that you guys were actually in control of all of the content, and clearly we have proof of that. Now, if you don't think that this is important to your constituents and the American people from those saying that this was a pointless hearing, I suggest you find other jobs. Chairman, I yield my time.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Chair.
Yeah, I just want to call to the attention of the chair and members
Mr. Mafume, yes,
that
you're
we're getting
recognized.
awfully close to witness intimidation, and I would ask the chair to intervene.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said, Mr. Mafume.
I said I would caution all members that we were getting very close to witness intimidation, right on the verge of it, and I would ask that the chair and the ranking member agree how we will proceed from this point on. It was the threats that were just made.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And in follow-up to that, I am curious about the committee's rule or the committee's disposition, accusing witnesses of a crime, discussing arrest, discussing, making these allusions and threats. I want to clarify for the record, what is the committee's policy around threatening a witness?
We have the member decorum. Do we have a witness decorum?
And around the rules of decorum, can
Yes.
we agree that threatening a witness comes close to broaching general decorum? It does broach general decorum of the committee?
With all due respect, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, we don't agree that there was any witness threatening.
In threatening, when we discuss arrest, when we discuss a potential arrest of a witness and alluding to a witness or suggestion of a witness committing a crime without evidence and without documents being supported to the record.
Can you be more specific?
When we talk about arresting a witness, or when we talk about a witness, insinuating that a witness is lying without documentation, I fear that this constitutes threatening a witness, and that will broach the rules of decorum of this committee. And I'd like to ask that we request witnesses be treated with respect. Thank you.
Appreciate that, and I will remind everyone of the member decorum and witness decorum to treat everyone with respect. Thank you, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. Do you have anything to add?
No, thank you. I agree with you, Mr. Chairman. I have a separate point of order I just wanted to raise, which is it seems as if several members now seem to have access to some information from Twitter that people on our side don't have, and I would just hope that anybody who's communicated directly with Twitter or received any information relating to witnesses who has that, who plans to use it, distribute it to the committee in advance. That's okay.
I think that most of the think the evidence is coming from, I think a lot of the quotes and emails are on the laptop.
Well, I think that at least one member indicated.
The Twitter files that Elon Musk has.
Well, one member had indicated that
laptop.
she had received information directly from Twitter.
Okay.
Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New York as they recognized.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Squilacci, I just want to speak to a little bit of the conduct that was directed towards you earlier. I think that, we in this committee, I rarely see anyone ask someone if they have a PhD or not. And if they don't have a PhD, then their experience is illegitimate, and so on and so forth. And I think it was inappropriate for a member to attack your extensive experience just because you don't have an experience as a corporate executive or trying to squeeze families for profit that you shouldn't be listened to. I think that is inappropriate. We wouldn't do that in any other form of experience. All forms of experience are legitimate, and yours is very necessary here in this hearing, particularly because it does provide that balance, and it speaks more to the state of our body that there seem to be people that think anything outside of corporate experience is illegitimate. So thank you for being here today. You deserve better than that. But I'll dive into it. One of the pieces of legislation, as has been extensively discussed, that's on the table today is the Tap American Energy Act. And it gives away more and more lands to fossil fuel development. It locks up and locks them up from potential productive use, other productive uses like renewable energy development and climate mitigation, and makes it even easier for industry to avoid public input and the consequences of their actions. So let's talk about this whole leasing issue. Mr. Squilacci, on average, how many drilling permits are approved each year on federal land?
Thank you, Congresswoman, and thank you for your kind comments. I've got a pretty thick skin, and I'm reasonably confident about my own experience and expertise. I was not cowed by the comments of your colleague. I believe that the number is somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
I think it's about 3,000 permits that are issued every year. And as I mentioned in my testimony, we have 9,600 outstanding permits on our public land. So it's not as if the oil and gas industry doesn't have the opportunity to develop more public land, oil and gas. I think the question is, do we really need to exacerbate the existing problem of all these leases and lands that are not being used despite the fact that they're tied up for many, many years.
Mm-hmm. And, from our data, that's absolutely right. Nearly 3,000 drilling permits are approved each year. And how many wells are drilled annually out of that 3,000?
I don't know the number. I'm guessing that you've got the number in front of you. But the point, I think the broader point that needs to be made here is that there is not a lack of opportunity for the oil and gas industry to develop our public lands. What we really need to think about is a transition. I talked a little bit in my written testimony about the fact that the coal companies, a decade ago or so, many of us were arguing that we needed to think about the transition away from coal because it was going to happen. And we couldn't get people to listen to the need to manage the decline, if you will, of coal. And what happened, we saw what happened. The big coal companies all went bankrupt, some several times, and the result was really devastating for a lot of the workers and the coal-dependent communities, while the executives made out like bandits. And I suspect we're going to see something similar in the oil and gas industry. Not today, not in the next couple, 2 or 3 years, but if we start looking over the next decade or two, we are likely to see a significant change in that industry. And I think the most important thing is for the American government to think about that transition. How are we going to manage it to make sure that we don't leave these dependent communities holding the bag, if you will, from the loss of jobs and the loss of an economic opportunity that they have? I think it can happen. We're seeing a fair amount of transition of oil company employees to renewable energy. That's great. I just think that we need to sort of manage it better at sort of the national level, because I think it's coming whether folks like it or not.
I mean, it's such an excellent point, Mr. Squillace, because our goals here are to actually protect and be proactive for coal workers and fossil fuel workers, because they were left holding the bag in the case of the coal industry. This transition was not prepared for, and there was almost this artificial propping up of the coal industry until the market forces just really saw this not work out. And in fact, there may be giggling here at that, but we saw even the other side resist pension protections for those coal workers. So I don't want to hear, this giggling at that, because we saw that pensions by the Republican Party were opposed for those fossil fuel workers until Democrats stepped in. But, and thankfully we were able to advance a bipartisan protection of that. But it wasn't until we were able to advance that. And I think that planning that transition is going to be essential. Thank you for raising that point.
Thank you, gentlewoman from New York. The gentlewoman from Colorado is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding the
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2.5 minutes to the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think what we're seeing here today is the Republican Party's attempt to take some of the most heinous legislation that we are seeing passed on the state level to attack our trans and LGBT, as well as people from marginalized communities, right to exist in schools. This flowery language of quote-unquote parental rights and freedom hides the sinister fact of this legislative text. If you notice in these arguments, they are not really discussing what is actually in this legislation. It includes 2 provisions that require schools to out trans, non-binary, and LGBT youth, even if it would put said youth in harm's way. One of the highest rates of youth homelessness is in the LGBT community, from parents who want to kick their children out in households that may be unstable or abusive. For so many children of abuse, school is their only safe place to be. But before they claim that this is not about banning books and not about harming the LGBT community, let's just look at the impacts of similar Republican legislation that has already passed on the state level. Look at these books that have already been banned due to Republican measures. The Life of Rosa Parks. This apparently is too woke by the Republican Party. Song of Solomon is unacceptable to Republican politics. 40% of banned books have reported are significantly addressing and specifically addressing LGBT issues. To say and talk about government reach and freedom, this Republican bill is asking the government to force the outing of LGBT people before they are ready. And talking about the rights of parents in this gallery today, the National Parents Union is here saying, don't do this. I have a letter that I'd like to submit where they are asking the Republican Party to keep culture wars out of classrooms. Our children need urgent and aggressive educational solutions. The American Library Association coming out against this Republican proposal. When we talk about progressive values, I can say what my progressive value is, and that is freedom over fascism. Thank you very much.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman.
Representative Ocasio-Cortez for 5 minutes.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I thank the ranking member, and there was some discussion made earlier, an allegation that Democrats have yet to introduce any policy to reduce our energy costs, as if we have completely forgotten about the sweeping multi-billion-dollar investments in the Inflation Reduction Act to reduce people's costs across the board. But I'm rising today to stand in opposition to H.R. 1. While Republicans try to claim that this is a bill to lower people's energy costs, we really see when you start digging into it that what this bill actually shows us by the Republican authors is that they actually have no plan to reduce our utility bills or even prevent climate disaster in the United States. The central argument and logic of this bill is that if you give big oil everything they want, then perhaps they will lower our gas prices. It's a form of trickle-down fantasy that just will not make life easier for everyday Americans. What H.R. 1 will do is give big oil more leases of public lands. And this idea that an increased supply of fossil fuels will drive down prices is also mistaken. Let's look at what happened last year. We saw how big oil more than doubled its profits to $219 billion, all while price gouging customers at the pump, not because of supply issues, but because they can. Republicans opposed solutions that we even put forward, like a windfall tax on price gouging on big oil in order to prevent these kinds of behaviors. But fossil fuel companies, moreover, already have thousands of unused permits on public lands, and yet they want even more. This is not a problem of supply, it is a problem of greed and abuse of market power. I, along with many of my colleagues, called for that windfall tax. But what does this bill do instead? It's almost as if you gave a pen to an oil lobbyist and wrote down everything that they'd want. Much of that was in this bill. We are looking at reducing big oil's royalty rates to the public, slashing interest fees. For people following at home, if you are a member of the American public, if you are a tax-paying citizen, you are part of the ownership of our public lands. And when an oil company decides to lease that land, they are supposed to pay a royalty to the public. What does H.R. 1 do? Slashes that royalty rate, so that there is very little payback or investment into the American people and many of our programs. In this bill, Republicans are squarely on the side of fossil fuel companies. It makes it harder for communities to fight big oil when they don't want them drilling in their own backyards. It also threatens our public lands and allows anyone to stake a mining claim on our public lands for less than $10 an acre, even if they haven't discovered any minerals. And despite the fact that more than 40% of Americans live in counties hit by climate disasters, this bill prohibits agencies from even considering climate change when deciding whether or not to issue a permit to a drilling company. None of these things are going to lower our costs at the pump. None of these things are going to actually reduce our utility bills. And in fact, in talking about this allegation of a lack of Democratic proposals, Democrats introduced 95 amendments, proposed 95 amendments to this bill, and the Republican majority rejected all but 7. I myself personally sponsored an amendment in the spirit of this bill, allegedly, to try to reduce prices. And my amendment would have made sure that the subsidies that the federal government provides to oil and gas companies actually make their way to the American people instead of lining the pockets of billionaire CEOs, but actually having the intended effect. But Republicans rejected that amendment too. They've made clear where they stand. And I could not emphasize enough how detrimental and damaging this bill would be, not only to the climate crisis, not only to the purpose of even trying to reduce our utility costs, but moreover, from the ability for the American people to actually receive an investment on the public lands that they lease out. And with that, I yield back to the ranking member.
Chair recognizes Ms. Ocasio-Cortez from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to yield 30 seconds to the ranking member, Raskin.
Thank you kindly, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. Congress committed $24 billion in security assistance to Ukraine in their war of self-defense against the brutal invasion by Russia. And to ensure the proper use of that funding, Congress and the administration established robust oversight structures to detect fraud and abuse, and that included additional funding for the IGs of DOD, the State Department, and the United States Agency for International Development. And recent testimony from administration officials confirm that these robust oversight structures are working. On February 28th, the House Armed Services Committee held a hearing during which DOD's Undersecretary of Defense for Policy testified the agency has provided Ukrainians with supplies to track the systems the U.S. has provided, including scanners and software, and that they have not seen any evidence of diversion. So I just want to say that you have helped us get ready for that. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the ranking member. Now, I want to dive into a little bit of what we're looking at today. This week, Republicans introduced their legislation to bring the United States government into default. That is what is happening. And that would introduce a destabling and profoundly unprecedented process that would initiate across-the-board cuts of an estimated 22% to most agency budgets, including cuts to life-saving medical care, Social Security, student debt, SNAP benefits. And in all of that, my colleagues seem to forget another way to solve our impending fiscal crisis. This isn't just about continued cuts to the poor and to the working class in our essential services, but we can raise revenue. In fact, in tax cuts in 2017 passed by the other side of the aisle, we see wonderful tax cuts for yacht owners and private jets. But in order to balance our budget now, we're talking about cuts to SNAP, to food out of babies' mouths, instead of actually re-examining the inequities within our tax system. Let's look into the decreasing IRS's revenue that has contributed to a loss in revenue from taxing the wealthiest Americans. Mr. Dodaro, how much have appropriations for IRS enforcement activities decreased since 2010?
I'm going to ask Jay McTighe, our expert in IRS, to respond.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. The appropriations for IRS have declined considerably since 2010, roughly 20% when adjusted for inflation, and roughly the same amount when looking at enforcement in particular.
And we've seen, according to your May 22 report, Mr. Dodaro, GAOs, you reported a decrease in audit rates of individual tax returns, correct?
That's correct.
And in that same report, you state that the tax community has also raised concerns about whether the IRS is selecting taxpayers for audit in an equitable manner. Can you explain the concern with respect to the equity of audits and particularly any drops in audit rates for incomes making over $500,000 a year?
I'll ask Mr. McTighe to respond.
Again, thank you, Congresswoman. In the report that you referenced, we did point out that audit rates have declined by about a third since 2010 across the board, but they have declined more dramatically for higher income individuals. And the reason behind that has really been a resource and a capacity issue. Auditing high-income, high-wealth individuals, partnerships, corporations require a lot of expertise, both human capital as well as information technology and analytics, whereas auditing lower-income individuals is much more straightforward. The IRS has a lot of information from third parties on income, such as wages, and less information on other types of income. So there's a wide disparity there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And to your note, auditing the rich is an enormously complex process that takes a lot of manpower. And the cuts to IRS enforcement are strategic, and they have resulted in a loss of revenue. Is that correct?
IRS has been unable over the past decade to backfill, very highly skilled individuals.
Thank you. I apologize. I just have to reclaim because I don't have time. But what we see here, and I'd like to submit unanimous consent to submit the report from the GAO, that there was an 87% decline in audits for taxpayers making between $500,000 and $5 million. And according to the GAO, we've seen that the new funding for the IRS that we've recently put in the Inflation Reduction Act has increased those revenues over 10 years. So instead of looking at climate and instead of looking at cuts to health care, we should examine why our colleagues in the Republican Party is so invested in protecting the wealthiest people in this society and would rather attack health care and services for our veterans than repealing tax cuts for yacht owners and private jets. And with that, I yield my time.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Ocasio-Cortez from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for this hearing, Mr. Chair. I think it's incredibly important that we tackle these issues substantively. And I've been very surprised to hear some of the commentary across the other side of the aisle. I heard earlier a Republican saying someone should go to jail for how expensive some drugs are in this country, and I thought I saw a pig flying across the ceiling of this committee room. But where there is common ground, I think we should pursue it, and we should pursue it aggressively. Now, I want to take a step back here and really make sure that we are illustrating this issue in a way that the public can understand. Because if we do that, then I think we can all get on the same page about developing energy towards a solution. So if I'm just an everyday person and I'm getting a prescription from my doctor and I get that prescription, I take it to my pharmacist, and then all of a sudden I get a bill and I realize that my insurance copay, whether it's for any condition, diabetes, cancer, whatever it may be, it could be $1,000. And before you know it, you're paying your rent check on a medication that you need to save your life. And we need to take a step back and figure out, how did we get here? Especially on drugs like insulin, where there's a public patent and there really is no reason for it to be that expensive. So we see that there's a drug between the drug and you receiving that at a pharmacy. There are several steps. You have your drug manufacturer, which folks call Big Pharma. Then you have your insurer. Those are the areas that I think people understand. Someone makes the drug, someone insures that drug that I can buy it, but then there's someone in the middle. And that is known as a PBM, or a pharmacy benefit manager. Isn't that correct, Mr. Asasi?
Yes.
And so what we see is that the drug manufacturer very often does not sell their medication directly to the pharmacy, or does not sell their medication directly to the insurer, but there is this middle person known as a PBM. And they will set a price, the manufacturer will set a price very high, and the PBM will say, let's make a deal. And they say, if you give me a rebate, then I can make the formulary for the insurance, and I can make sure that your drug gets covered by this insurance. You can sell a lot of your drug, and then, all is well in the world. And that's the general concept, the pitch from the PBM. Isn't that right? Do I have that correct?
There's a few more middlemen, but that's exactly it in a nutshell.
And each step along the way, someone is taking a cut.
Yep.
You've got the manufacturers charging, you've got the PBMs charging, you have insurers, and then before you know it, you're paying a rent check on insulin, which should cost virtually nothing. Now, my question here is that we have to figure out a solution. We have a vicious cycle with the PBMs because they say, if you give me a rebate, I'll pass it on to the insurers. So the drug manufacturer says, great, I'll make my price even higher. So I'll say that my list price for a drug is $5,000, so then I can charge you $1,000 or even more, and I'll make you seem like you're getting a deal so that you'll put me on a higher level in the formulary. And all about this process is focused on who's making how much money, instead of what people are getting the treatment that they need. Now, I'm very curious, genuinely, to hear from the other side of the aisle and some of our witnesses here today. Everyone okay over there? From the other side of the aisle and some of our witnesses here today about solutions. I'll be candid about mine. I believe that the profit-seeking motive in the pharmaceutical industry is out of control, and I think that it is what is hurting people. I personally believe that if you have a public entity that does not have a profit motive, like Medicare, negotiate these prices with the manufacturers, including the transparency that we see, along with other entities like TRICARE, Medicaid, et cetera, then we can get an actual fair price for these medications that includes their manufacturing and R&D costs, but will not finance stock buybacks and other types of predatory behavior. And then I believe that Medicare should expand its eligibility so that people can buy into at-cost public insurance. Now, I understand that not everyone in this room agrees with that assessment. I am very curious to hear about any other proposals, because I think at the core, what we're talking about is an extreme, out-of-control profit motive that has virtually no guardrails, and that Congress doesn't impose guardrails on for a whole bunch of other dark money reasons. And so I'm interested to hear from Dr. Atkins, Mr. Asasi, Dr. Duane, and Mr. Baker. In addition, we've heard about things like eliminating rebates. We've heard about things about increasing transparency. I think those are very important steps. I'm curious about what other solutions, whether broadly systemic or more tailored, that you all would propose to this committee that we consider in order to help actually solve this problem and go beyond talking about it.
I just wanted to say really quickly, you put your finger right on it, right on it. At the end of the day, the only reason PBMs exist is because we don't have the ability to fairly negotiate with Big Pharma. So we came up with PBMs, and I want to be really clear, this idea of repealing the rebate, this was under the Trump administration, the CBO scored that at $170 billion in cost, because PBMs are actually saving us money, right? But the fundamental problem, first of all, as we've heard about, one is in Medicare, PBMs have to operate under what's called a medical loss ratio, where we limit the amount of money they can make in profits. That doesn't exist in other areas, right? So first of all, let's put them on some guardrails and say, look, at the end of the day, this isn't going to be about you putting money in your coffers. It's about getting a good price for the American family, right? Two, to the same end, we got to create a lot more transparency, particularly for like the Federal Employees Health Benefit Program we heard about, or other large employers, right? That they can actually see what is the fundamental, the net price I'm paying, so that they can actually track and keep and hold them accountable. But let's not forget, at the end of the day, when you look at all the money flowing through the system, the manufacturers are getting 12 times more profit than everyone else. So this is all about one major problem. Drug makers are extorting obscene prices from the American public, and it needs to end.
Chair recognizes Mr. Palmer from Alabama for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask Mr. Baker some questions about when you're
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of our colleagues here who have made such incredible and forceful arguments. I want to reiterate one point. The reason why anyone is asking anyone on this stage about what we would vote for is because Kevin McCarthy needs our votes. Because Kevin McCarthy doesn't have the votes. Because Kevin McCarthy is going to the White House without a majority of his caucus. He does not have what is necessary to negotiate. And for any question about what anybody would settle for, he has responsibility to concede. So if he wants any Democratic support, he has to come to the table. And we have seen him over and over again say that he will not negotiate, that they are engaged in hostage taking, not negotiation, extortion, not conversation. And that is not something we can establish. It is not something we can reinforce in this country. The proposal that we see on this table right now that Kevin McCarthy and the Republican caucus have put down has been an absolute rejection of the same reckless tax cuts that were passed in 2017 that we said at the time would explode the debt ratio, that would explode the deficit. And now, several years later, we are in this scenario. And instead of them recognizing the error of their ways, they want to protect tax cuts on yachts and private jets and make single moms pay for it. And that's where we say no. That's where we say the American people did not elect House progressives so that we can lay back while people's food benefits are cut. We're here to fight for working families. And so this is the last caucus to ask, what are we going to give up in terms of people's food, in terms of people's health care, in terms of veterans? And the time is now to ask the Republican caucus why they are valuing billionaires over veterans and single mothers. This is shameful. We can put an end to it. And it only takes 5 of the 18 Republicans that are in Biden-carried seats. Thank you.
Cortez for
Thank you.
5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I just have to commend Congressman Connolly for his strong performance. And he took my reference to the jungle that I wanted to discuss today as well. But, you know, it's really just astonishing to me that we are having a hearing today about regulations, not a specific regulation, just regulations. Are they good? Should they exist? Let's dig into it. We long know that regulations are written in blood. That's very often what is communicated by people, by communities, by labor, by workers, by many more. And even now, hearing a mockery of cheese, right? You have Republicans saying, oh, look at how tightly regulated our government is. We even regulate cheese. Well, pregnant women cannot eat all forms of dairy because this is a food that contains bacterial growths, and it poses risks. But perhaps if the other side of the aisle had more fluency and had more knowledge of a woman's body, perhaps they would suffer less in this policy making. Let's look at other current regulatory rollbacks the Republican Party is currently trying to pursue. Let's talk about airlines. Right now, we are seeing that lawmakers and Republicans are currently trying to push rollbacks on airline regulations. This has come with the forceful pushback from the Pilots Association, as well as communities that have suffered and who have lost families on this. But let's dive in. What we are seeing right now is Republicans trying to roll back a rule on the number of hours that pilots must require in order to train, in order to be licensed. And Ms. Katzen, are you familiar at all with the Federal Aviation Administration's 1,500-hour rule?
Very lightly, but yes, I'm aware of its requirements.
This rule requires pilot in training, requires a pilot in training to have a minimum of 1,500 hours of flight time before flying a commercial plane. Seems pretty reasonable to me. If you're dealing with thousands of people and transporting thousands of people and commanding an airplane, seems like you should have pretty thorough training. This rule was enacted not because of some bureaucrat having an idea somewhere, but it was enacted as in 2010 following the Colgan airplane crash that tragically killed 50 people near Buffalo, New York. Now, once the rule was mandated by Congress, FAA implemented the law. And we're hearing the same arguments from the other side of the aisle saying these regulations are too onerous, that it's too much of an imposition. But these families have paid the price. They have paid the price. When we see these regulations, and we have heard it themselves, including from the president of the Pilots Association, saying these regulations are written in blood. Food regulations. This committee has overseen PFAS poisoning. Communities that are often low income, that don't have anyone to protect them. Rural, urban, inner city, wherever. They are poisoned when they are not protected. And that is the actual term. People discuss the term regulation. What these are protections for people, often who have no one else to protect them, who do not have a corporate legal team to protect them, who have endured loss, who have endured disease, fertilities, cancers. This is why we have regulations. Ms. Katzen, from your experience and expertise, even though a rule is mandated by Congress, for a rule like this to be implemented, it would still have to go through an extensive process, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And a rule like this would go through an extensive process oftentimes to ensure safety for people, right?
Correct. And the input of those on the ground who may know more than those who are drafting the rules. So it's an informed process.
And unsurprising to no one, this regulation had a massive impact on fatalities with the pilot hour requirement, training hour requirement. From 1990 to 2010, the FAA counted 1,720 fatalities involving passenger and cargo flights. Once the rule was finally implemented, from 2011 to to 2021, the FAA counted only 14 fatalities. 14. Only 14 fatalities after implementing this rule, when the direct years prior to that, we saw 1,720 Americans dead. And yet we're here discussing rolling back a regulatory state, not even pointing out a specific area. Not even a specific area. I mean, what are we here for? I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, but the purpose of the committee hearing is to talk about many different regulations. And I'm amused that the gentlelady is concerned about raising the age, the regulation that limits the age for pilots when there's a shortage of pilots, but they're okay with a President of the United States who's more than 20 years older than the minimum age.
Mr. Chairman, since you're referring to me, it's not age, it's training hour time. The number of hours that an individual is training, not the age.
Well, part of the regulation's the age as well. Chair recognizes Mr. Arms Cortez for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I just have to commend Congressman Connolly for his strong performance. And he took my reference to the jungle that I wanted to discuss today as well. But, you know, it's really just astonishing to me that we are having a hearing today about regulations, not a specific regulation, just regulations. Are they good? Should they exist? Let's dig into it. We long know that regulations are written in blood. That's very often what is communicated by people, by communities, by labor, by workers, by many more. And even now, you know, hearing a mockery of cheese, right? You have Republicans saying, oh, look at how tightly regulated our government is. We even regulate cheese. Well, pregnant women cannot eat all forms of dairy because this is a food that contains bacterial growths, and it poses risks. But perhaps if the other side of the aisle had more fluency and had more knowledge of a woman's body, perhaps they would suffer less in this policy making. Let's look at other current regulatory rollbacks the Republican Party is currently trying to pursue. Let's talk about airlines. Right now, we are seeing that lawmakers and Republicans are currently trying to push rollbacks on airline regulations. This has come with the forceful pushback from the Pilots Association, as well as communities that have suffered and who have lost families on this. But let's dive in. What we are seeing right now is Republicans trying to roll back a rule on the number of hours that pilots must require in order to train, in order to be licensed. And Ms. Katzen, are you familiar at all with the Federal Aviation Administration's 1,500-hour rule?
Very lightly, but yes, I'm aware of its requirements.
This rule requires pilot in training, requires a pilot in training to have a minimum of 1,500 hours of flight time before flying a commercial plane. Seems pretty reasonable to me. If you're dealing with thousands of people and transporting thousands of people and commanding an airplane, seems like you should have pretty thorough training. This rule was enacted not because of some bureaucrat having an idea somewhere, but it was enacted as in 2010 following the Colgan airplane crash that tragically killed 50 people near Buffalo, New York. Now, once the rule was mandated by Congress, FAA implemented the law. And we're hearing the same arguments from the other side of the aisle saying these regulations are too onerous, that it's too much of an imposition. But these families have paid the price. They have paid the price. When we see these regulations, and we have heard it themselves, including from the president of the Pilots Association, saying these regulations are written in blood. food regulations. This committee has overseen PFAS poisoning. Communities that are often low income, that don't have anyone to protect them, rural, urban, inner city, wherever. They are poisoned when they are not protected, and that is the actual term. People discuss the term regulation. What these are protections for people, often who have no one else to protect them, who do not have a corporate legal team to protect them, who have endured loss, who have endured disease, fertilities, cancers. This is why we have regulations. Ms. Katzen, from your experience and expertise, even though a rule is mandated by Congress, for a rule like this to be implemented, it would still have to go through an extensive process, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And a rule like this would go through an extensive process, oftentimes to ensure safety for people, right?
Correct. And the input of those on the ground who may know more than those who are drafting the rules. So it's an informed process.
And unsurprising to no one, this regulation had a massive impact on fatalities with the pilot with the pilot hour requirement, training hour requirement. From 1990 to 2010, the FAA counted 1,720 fatalities involving passenger and cargo flights. Once the rule was finally implemented, from 2011 to 2021, the FAA counted only 14 fatalities, 14. Only 14 fatalities after implementing this rule, when the direct years prior to that, we saw 1,720 Americans dead. And yet we're here discussing rolling back a regulatory state, not even pointing out a specific area. Not even a specific area. I mean, what are we here for? I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, but the purpose of the committee hearing is to talk about many different regulations. And I'm amused that the gentlelady is concerned about raising the age, the regulation that limits the age for pilots when there's a shortage of pilots, but they're okay with a President of the United States who's more than 20 years older than the minimum age.
Mr. Chairman, since you're referring to me, it's not age, it's training hour time. The number of hours that an individual is training, not the age.
Well, part of the regulation's the age as well. Chair recognizes Mr. Armstrong.
Last year, we saw the rollback of the Dobbs, in the Dobbs decision, of people's ability to have bodily autonomy. And what's very important in the overturning of Dobbs is that we're not just talking about abortion rights, but we're talking about our privacy rights overall as well. And that is a deep, deep concern to us all. But even more concerning on top of that is that, and we'll get to the student debt relief as well, is that we are learning in the weeks before these decisions are coming down that these Supreme Court justices have been receiving financial benefits from billionaire benefactors with interests and cases before the Supreme Court. And that is something that we have to put a stop to right now. We need to put a stop to it yesterday and the day before that. And some of the ways that we are proposing to do that is that I believe that there should be congressional investigations into the Supreme Court and into this unethical activity. The Senate asked Chief Justice Roberts to come before and testify before the Senate regarding these deeply disturbing revelations. And the Chief Justice said no, refused to come before Congress to answer questions about this. If they refuse to come up, then I believe we should submit a subpoena in order to investigate. No person in the United States, no person should be above the law, including a Supreme Court justice, period. And so,
And that concludes our questions. Again, I want to thank you all for being here. I'm going to yield to the much improved ranking member, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez from New York for closing statement.
I'll take the gold star. Thank you, Chairman. And I'd like to thank our witnesses here today. Once again, we acknowledge fully that this is not easy and that your respect, your service and your public service here is respected and acknowledged and valued. So thank you. Thank you for your testimony. I think it is important for us to, summarize much of what we heard and saw today, and overall what this matter is about. A U.S. attorney, handpicked by Attorney General Barr, has for 4 years investigated, together with a dozen agents and at least 4 prosecutors from his office and the tax division of the Department of Justice, the son of President Biden. Hunter Biden has been charged with a felony and misdemeanors, and 2 misdemeanors, and he is pleading guilty to several crimes and submitting to sentencing by an appointed judge, a Trump-appointed judge. However, we are also seeing today is an effort to find some issue with this prosecution, this existing prosecution. This is a person who has admitted to crimes, and finding evidence of political interference, a very serious charge. So much of what we saw today honed in on a conversation, the testimony honed in on a conversation that one of today's witnesses was involved in which Mr. Shapley heard Mr. Weiss to say that he was denied special counsel status. That account had been contradicted by the U.S. Attorney Weiss, who has reiterated several times that he had full authority to bring any charges in any district and had received assurances from the Department of Justice that if he needed special attorney status, not counsel, but rather attorney status to bring those charges, it would be granted. So we are left here with 2 possible options for this story. That either Mr. Weiss, who was appointed by President Donald J. Trump and trusted by Attorney General Barr, also serving under Trump, was lying to protect the Biden administration, or he respectfully disagreed with the charges that today's 2 witnesses wanted to bring as professionals in their professional opinion. Disagreement over charges is not uncommon. The IRS Criminal Tax Counsel attorneys have disagreed in charging decisions, as we heard here today, 90% of the time. And in this particular case, reviewing attorneys at IRS and the tax division raised issues with the proposed charges. And the witnesses described how Mr. Weiss expressed some concerns about the charges. In fact, in some of the testimony we saw, Mr. Shapley recognized with regard to at least one of the charges which he himself recommended he could, and I am quoting from testimony, quote, see some issues with that would preclude it from being charged. Now, I understand why the 2 witnesses who testified here today are disappointed after 5 years of investigation. I believe you all are honorable, serving professionals, truly. And that Mr. Weiss disagreed with this analysis of facts. There was absolutely frustration that to not, quote, have a seat at the table, that Mr. Weiss made his decision about how to charge in this case, and he did charge. And that was a decision that he, as the U.S. attorney in charge of the case, was empowered to make. The question, though, I believe, that is very important to address is why we are holding these hearings today, despite what we have seen as deliberate lobbying for this hearing by a political candidate, Donald J. Trump. What we also saw today was the revival of certain conspiracy theories around Ukraine, first promoted by Rudy Giuliani during Trump's first impeachment in 2019 and his reelection campaign. We did not bring that up. That was first brought up by the Republican side that required addressing here today. Chairman Comer started this hearing by asking these witnesses about Burisma, and other members of the committee again raised the specter of these debunked conspiracy theories. It has been debunked time and time again, including by Trump's own Department of Justice. But that being said, this is the problem with bringing these conspiracy theories into this committee. They beget more. It does not stop. And today we have gotten a new conspiracy theory, one that requires us to believe that David Weiss, a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney, trusted by Trump-appointed Attorney General Barr, has somehow been complicit in abetting and concealing a deep state conspiracy to protect Hunter Biden on behalf of the Biden administration when they were selected by Donald Trump. This is a theory which has apparently been proven unsuccessful, given that Hunter Biden is now criminally charged and facing sentencing by a Trump-appointed judge. Today also marked a new low when pornographic images were paraded in this hearing room. Chairman Comer, last October, you told Time magazine that you were not interested in the sordid details of Hunter Biden's life. You were quoted as saying, quote, "That's counter to a credible investigation," and I agree. Sadly, that is a reflection of how low some individuals here have been willing to go in their efforts to attack the president and his family, and frankly, I don't care who you are in this country, no one deserves that. It is abuse. It is abusive. If Republicans truly want to get to the fact here, and they want to understand why Mr. Weiss decided to charge Hunter Biden the way he did, let's hear from Mr. Weiss. But until then, we must move on from these theories and focus on the issues that matter to the American people, like ending the scourge of gun violence that is plaguing our country, confronting and combating the climate crisis, and standing up for our constitutional rights, and yes, going after the enormous amount of inequity and injustice in our tax system. And with that, I yield back to the chair.
Gentlelady yields back.
Last note of business, I'd like to say thank you to the many groups and organizations that reached out in anticipation of this hearing today with letters outlining their stances on the issue. I'd like to enter into the record letters to the committee from the American Tort Reform Association, American Property Casualty Insurance Association, the Advanced Medical Technology Association, the Institute for Legal Reform, the International Legal Finance Association, National Association of Manufacturers, Jerry Theododro at the R Street Institute, without objection. So ordered. And then, okay. I would now like to yield 5 minutes to Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you, and I thank for the listing of all the special interests involved in addition in this hearing. Now, when I first heard that the Republican side was going to be calling a hearing on third-party influence in our courts, I was so excited because I thought, finally, we are going to address the biggest scandal in American democracy that we are currently having right now, which is the extraordinary corruption and wholesale purchase of members of the Supreme Court. And I also find it amusing that we just heard from the Republican side, why do we want to talk about this? Because women have lost the right to choose, because Indigenous people have lost rights, because minorities have lost rights, because working people across the country have lost rights due to this level of corruption. And if we're going to talk about third parties, let's talk about the Federalist Society, which has not only had deep ties to Justice Clarence Thomas and his wife Ginny, but has also helped choose judicial nominees for the Republican Party and directed multi-million-dollar media campaigns to confirm them, including a multi-million-dollar media campaign for Justice Alito, who seems to like using the Wall Street Journal as his personal press secretary. But I want to dig into a little bit about the influence here. In 2008, Leonard Leo, who's the head of the, who has ties to the Federalist Society, also organized a luxury fishing trip to Alaska, inviting a billionaire to join, Paul Singer. And when Paul Singer accepted, Leo asked if he could fly Justice Alito on his private jet to Alaska. So right here is Paul Singer, a multi-billionaire and a head of a hedge fund, works in hedge funds. And here is Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, AKA one of the justices turning over student loan cancellation, turning over women's rights to choose over their own body, and more. Now, Professor Clark, are you familiar with 5 U.S. Code 13104?
I'm so sorry, 5 U.S.C.
13104.
Is that the new codification of the Ethics in Government Act?
Yes, it's specifically on And it requires reporting and disclosure requirements to government officials, yes.
Yes.
And I want to draw attention to 13104A2A. This section requires disclosure of the identity of the source, a brief description, and a value of all gifts exceeding minimum value. Professor Clark, are you aware how much the minimal value of gifts was in 2008?
I would guess it would be about $400.
Yeah, a little bit under $335 is the amount of gifts in gifts that Supreme Court justices are allowed to receive, which is actually balling compared to members of Congress. We only are allowed to receive gifts under $50. So the Supreme Court, you can give them free AirPods, you can give them really nice dinners, and they don't have to report any of that. But so we're clear, any gifts above that do need to be disclosed, correct?
Correct.
Yet, according to ProPublica's reporting, Justice Alito was flown on a private jet on this luxury trip, and if he had chartered a similar jet, it would have cost more than $100,000 each way. $100,000. Now, Professor Clark, with the cost of about $100,000 per flight, would Justice Scalia be required to disclose this trip?
I believe you're referring to Justice Alito.
Alito, yes.
And yes, under the Ethics in Government Act, disclosure would be required.
And did he?
My understanding is that he did not.
He did not. So we have a billionaire who runs a hedge fund with business before the court. In fact, we saw several cases before the court. And on top of that, he also had 3 days at a luxury retreat, which would charge over $1,000 a night. And he didn't disclose that either. Now, in the years since, we've actually seen the billionaire who generously sponsored this trip, Paul Singer, did business before the court at least 10 times in cases where the legal press and mainstream media often covered his role. So it was publicly known that he had business before the court. And in 2014, in fact, Justice Samuel Alito, along with the court, agreed to resolve a vital issue in a decades-long battle between Singer's hedge fund and the nation of Argentina. And do you know if Alito recused himself from this case?
I believe he did not.
He did not recuse himself from this case. And in fact, he used his seat on the Supreme Court after all of this to rule in Singer's favor. And following the decision, Mr. Singer's hedge fund was ultimately paid $2.4 billion because of this ruling. Not a bad return on investment for a fishing trip there. Now, Professor Clark, would a federal judge in a lower court be required to recuse themselves?
The gentlelady's time has expired.
May I answer the question, sir?
I think the discretion of the chair, yes, you can answer the
Thank you,
question.
sir. Yes, there's a federal statute, I believe it's 28 U.S.C. 455, that does require recusal by both justices and judges under certain circumstances.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes.
All I gotta say is I can't go out to lunch in Florida in my free time, not doing anything, just eating outside, and it's wall-to-wall Fox News coverage. And then you have a member of Congress engaging in sexually lewd acts in a public theater, and they got nothing to say. I danced to Phoenix once in college, and it was like all over the place. But putting on a whole show of their own at Beetlejuice, and there's nothing. I'm just saying be consistent. That's all I'm asking for. Equal treatment. I don't expect it, but come on.
Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous.
Chair recognizes Ms. Mace.
Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to enter an article into the record dated January 6, 2019. A member of this own committee, the day after she was sworn in, came into Congress, and this article says, Dem split in response to her words, impeach the mother effer, the day after she was sworn in. Some might even say these kinds of comments, not only are they hypocritical by the left in their arguments today, but that this is an embarrassment to the time and people of this country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I'm afraid my friend, the gentlelady from South Carolina, just engaged in personalities against a fellow member of the committee.
Well, what entered in the record was, I believe it was Ms. Talib's.
Well, it was the
word.
commentary that accompanied
It
it
was
that
an
I'm referring
article
to.
from January 6,
what she said.
2018. Dim
Right.
split in response to impeach
Said
the
it.
mother effer comment by a member of this committee.
Right, it was the commentary, and in any event, it doesn't make any
No,
difference.
she said it. She actually said it.
No, but Rule 17
She said impeach the mother
The
effer.
commentary of what she is presenting.
The article title is
the
Dim
gentlelady's
split in response
commentary.
to
All right,
impeach
all
the
right,
mother
let's
effer
get
comment.
on with it. I mean,
That's
you know,
the
the
title of
government's
the
about to
article,
shut
Mr.
down,
Chairman.
okay?
Chair, order. Chair now recognize Mr. Lat.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Director Klein and our witnesses for being here today. Today, for the first time in 4 months, our colleagues across the aisle have gathered us here to discuss how the Biden administration needs to do more for offshore oil and gas. You know, it appears that this may be part of a broader campaign today to distract from the current House Republican chaos and their failures to elect a speaker or have a coherent plan to fund the government. But regardless, let's get into this. Today, we'll hear that the Biden administration needs to sell more oil and gas leases to big oil off our coast to ensure, quote, energy security, unquote, and our economic futures. But let's be clear. Big oil does not need more handouts. Oil and gas companies already control 12 million acres of federal water in the Gulf of Mexico alone. Over 75% of the leases industry holds remain unused. And to my own disappointment, the administration plans to hold 3 more lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico over the next 3 years, locking us into decades of future development. But still, this is never enough. If we want to have any chance of staving off the worst impacts of the climate crisis, it is essential that we begin to phase out fossil fuel extraction from federal lands and waters. Right now, the United States is the largest producer and the largest exporter of oil and gas in the world. And despite how my colleagues from across the aisle may make it seem, production in the Gulf of Mexico is at an all-time high. Oil companies are raking in billions of dollars in record profits, and CEOs are giving themselves tens of millions of dollars in salaries and bonuses, all while decreasing fossil fuel worker pay and systematically laying off the workforce. Despite this record production, record CEO pay, and record profit, Americans are still at the whim of the global market when it comes to energy prices here at home. Today's hearing focuses on how the Biden administration should somehow give away more public resources to big oil, all while the Gulf region experiences simultaneous crises caused both directly and indirectly by offshore drilling and fossil fuel development. As we speak, Louisiana, one of the states typically with the highest rainfall in the country, is experiencing an unprecedented wildfire season. In August, over 550 fires in Louisiana burned more than 60,000 acres, forcing entire towns to flee the flames. Governor Edwards warned that this wildfire risk is, quote, the new normal for the state. Drought, subsidence, rising seas, and man-made changes to the river have led to historically low water levels in the Mississippi River and allowed salt water from the Gulf of Mexico to creep up into local water sources. Thousands of people are already suffering from water that is unsafe to drink. It is corroding infrastructure and leaching heavy metals into drinking water systems. Hundreds of thousands of people in New Orleans could be threatened. Of course, there are also the ever-threatening hurricanes caused by climate change and the loss of wetlands from oil and gas infrastructure, the very natural barriers that are supposed to protect coastal communities from storms. There is abandoned oil and gas infrastructure, thousands of miles of pipelines littering the seafloor, which, if oil and gas companies paid to fully reclaim, could employ thousands of oil and gas workers as we look to transition and clean up the Gulf waters, but are more often left on the seafloor to pollute. There are also the public health impacts, increased rates of asthma and diseases like cancer around fossil fuel infrastructure, which disproportionately harm communities of color and low-income Americans. Yet time and time again, we continue to see the failure to consider any of these impacts of offshore drilling. I implore my colleagues to recognize these impacts and, instead of asking for more drilling, have productive conversations about a managed decline of fossil fuels, a transition that puts workers, communities, and climate first, so we don't make the same mistakes again as we shape a clean energy future. Offshore wind has enormous potential in the Gulf and across all our coasts to support family-sustaining union jobs and make our federal waters part of the climate solution rather than part of the problem. I look forward to our hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank